Okay. That's a bit strange. I seem to have crashed. Okay. We're currently running OBS, that's fine. So we need to do Discord and hello. Sorry, it appeared that everything just crashed. So that's super annoying. And am I back? Yes, I'm back and I'm there. Right. Sorry about that, everyone. For something crashed as I was trying to set up the stream, and of course, other things have crashed to also let me down because they don't want me to help you out. So, can I get from you all, either Britain or someone can pop on and answer the question? How would you define good and bad code? What have you been taught by your other lecturers about the distinction between good code and bad code? So, do you guys like? So, if we're gonna, wait, you can chat away in the wonderful demonstration of bad code, things crashing, things freezing. So, seems frozen. Yes, it was frozen. It took me a while to go and kind of restart things. So if we're talking about good code and bad code, now I know, have you guys? So which do you guys use? Google Docs as your collaborative tool when you're talking to lecturers? Do you use Miro? Do you use what is it? Other tools? What is the tool that you use for? Do you guys know Miro? Do you use Miro? What's the real time collaborative tool that you guys use in to talk with the lecturer? Or do you just draw on the whiteboard? Excalibur. Nice. Just a whiteboard. I haven't played with Excalibur. That'll be nice. So what I'll do is I shall, yeah. So I'll see if I can get. Apparently, my Google is not going to search. So what I'll do is I'll throw this code up here, and I'll see if I can. Can I edit that? Yes, I can to make it clearer. Yeah, that's close enough. So Miro pen and paper. So Miro is an acceptable use case. What I'll do is I'll just jump over to here. Because I'm interested in you talking about your definitions. We can put it in the chat and then I'll save it into the GitLab later. But in the room chat, what is it that makes the difference between good code and bad code? What are your thoughts? So if I put myself in the bottom corner here, so now this is me using Claude to turn some bad code into some better code just to try and show the student a better way of doing it. So here, this now, for a start, keep writing your definitions. Is working code a hygiene factor for good code and bad code, or is good code just meaning that code is working? What are your thoughts? I see a couple of you typing. So if you look at this code and you see this is Godot 3.4 code. So position, room position, vector, blah blah blah. That's fine. Var on edge. On edge equals x less than or equal to 1, or x greater than or equal to size minus 2, or y less than or equal to 1, or y greater than or equal to size. What might be my problem with that code? See, there's some more people writing. While you're writing, I shall pop over to here and grab my Miro login. So my internet seems to be really trying to kill me by not doing either of these two things. Admittedly, I do have quite a few things open. Okay, so let's have a look at bad code. So see it, throwing together code that you have that you've just put together without thinking. Not planned, not reusable, not readable. Okay, so I suppose I would disagree with the first two aspects of that, because thrown together and not planned for me doesn't mean that the code is bad. That means the process is bad. The code, you might get lucky and be good code. Even though you threw it together and you didn't plan it, it still might be good code, because the code doesn't care about the process by which it was made. The code cares about the reusability and the readability. Those are two things that would actually make the code itself bad rather than the process bad. Now, there is an interesting discussion in this space where if you're working for a hospital or a medical organization, the Electrical of Norway, for example, is another regulated coding environment. If you're working for a regulated coding environment, they regulate the quality of the code as well as the quality of the process. And so for them, they would say those first two, thrown together and not planned, those would fail the ISO tests on quality. Right? So do you guys know the ISO tests on quality? Have you discussed those with people? For games don't, well, normal game development doesn't have to worry about those ISO quality things, which is why I wouldn't worry about those two. Oh no, so you have no idea what the ISO game, okay, the ISO coding standards. So the ISO coding standards are, if you're gonna make a medical device, you have to code it in a particular way. Right? They actually specify the methodology for which you will do development. Right? So they're not just regulating the end product. Okay, so when we'll go to Sicily, there's good code, which is planned, programmed, interesting, reusable, which is the opposite of not reusable, follows a system. So that's usually that I will agree with that because it's about internal cognitive alignment, and documented, but no one has to overdose readable. So one of the things that I want, what I want to see in your code and what I consider good code is a combination of self-documenting and documentation that helps me as a skilled programmer understand what your program is doing. Which means I don't need a lot of comments. I only need sort of professional level comments, not explanatory comments. I don't need you to explain the code in your comments. I need you to put comments in there where you do something non-standard, or where you're doing something standard but is really tricky, or where you want it very clear how, like, why you chose to do something a particular way, so that if I change it, I understand the consequences of that change. Okay, so there's a kind of, so sometimes there's a meta narrative around your code. There's this idea that's outside of the what you can see, and that is kind of, that sometimes need to be commented, because I'm not there to just make this particular piece of code usable. I need to understand, if I make this kind of change, what other parts of the code it would affect. Okay, so if we look up, and maybe I can get another web page to load, because apparently I can. I just can't use that bit. I can do some Miro stuff, but what I was actually thinking of doing is, so we look at the international standards for coding. So if we go to the ISO organization, I can bring that over here. So just so you're aware, when we talk about quality, standardized coding practice, so ISO not just has, how JPEG and communication standards, but also talks about standardizing practices and identity management or cryptography, and then it has some of the standards around how you implement particular things. So as I said, they have the ISO MPEG system technologies, so they can talk about, they have a standard for how you encode things so you can decode them, but they also have medical devices, so so they've got lots of connectors of reservoir delivery systems for health applications. So ports and neural. So lots of standards around devices, medical devices, and if we have software engineering, So that's 25021. And so this is software product quality requirements and evaluation data quality model. So these define the quality of the data, right? They define and evaluated quality, data quality requirements of data. So there are standards. Games never use those standards, but other industries do use these standards for high quality code. If we have a look, we've got so yeah, just so you know that there are these standards, and you can go and look them up and see what would be expected. So Yona, clean, simple as can be works. Bad, messy, overcomplicated does not work. Good code, readable, documented, single responsibility. Ooh, single responsibility. That's a nice example of, yeah, so a single responsibility is certainly a very Linuxy thing to do, right? Because what Linux does is Linux said, look, you should only, that the Unix shell scripting environment is the idea that you pipe commands, and so each command should do one thing and exactly one thing and no one thing. And if you want to build up a sequence of things, you should just string them together, right? Because complex things are just a string of simple things. And so this is the idea that your code should also follow that kind of mentality, that a function should do a single thing. Do you guys also know the difference between, with side effects and programming to avoid side effects and functional programming? Because you did some functional programming. But I can see that readability has come up. One of the things that I would emphasize with readability is readability by other programmers. All right? So I really want you, like, as we go into this last push to get your games made, in the last, we've got 4 weeks left, 4.5, because it's the 15th, so nearly 5. So we've got 4 weeks. In terms of increasing the quality of the code that you write, I think of code as communication between me and other programmers. And so good code is good communication between me and other programmers. And I actually consider a hygiene factor of working is a hygiene factor. Working is merely a good. It's not broken. Broken doesn't make it good. Broken means it's not bad. Right? So good and bad are not opposites. Right? So good and not good. And bad and not bad. And so there's code in the middle there, which is both not good and not bad. And that's code, I would say, code with bugs in it, to some extent, by definition for me, is bad code. It has code that's not, it's not the only thing that can lead to bad code is code not working. Because you can have working code that's still bad code. Right? It's just you can't have good code that's also not functional. So it's a limiter on good code, not a limiter on bad code. Because some people think if they get the code working, that means it's good. And that's not true. So we could go down it's around functional requirements and non-functional requirements. And you could argue good code is code that fits its functional and non-functional requirements if you're going down a user experience UX kind of route. So certainly the readability has come through from a bunch of definitions. Simplicity has come through. There's an overcut the simple and single responsibility overcomplicated. There is certainly an aspect of efficiency that you should be aware of when you're coding. But you also have to be aware that most of what we know about efficient coding is generally not true. because most of what you know is about a kind of most of the way your brain works. Your intuition isn't generally good at understanding how a GPU can be optimized. And we tend to talk about efficiency and think of it in a very linear way in our brain. And if we only had a single threaded CPU, then yes, your intuitions about efficiency and O notation and all that work done would be reasonable. The problem is that's not the devices we're using. And so I tend to have efficiency low on my list of what makes good code. That makes fast code. And if you need it to be fast, that might be good. But most of the time you don't need it to be that fast. And so it's saying, that a hot rod with big wheels and a massive engine is the best vehicle to take shopping. And it's kind of, no, it's a terrible vehicle to take shopping. It's really fast, but it's not convenient. So it doesn't solve the purpose, right? So you've got to understand what is the purpose of this code to decide if it's good or not. Yes, the software security, they probably hopefully mentioned ISO multiple times. And it's one way of defining good code. I wouldn't use it personally. Yeah, but I've not heard about this one. There's been a lot of talk on social media about clean code also. But is clean code equal to good code? Clean code equal to good code. So one of the things that I want you to kind of take away and think about, because I know your brains are full of things at the moment, but to think about mental models, right? And I think about clean code as it's easy to see the mental model of the developer and what they were trying to do. And if you can understand what they were trying to do when you try and debug it or try and update it or modify it, if you know what the program was trying to do and the picture that the code paints is the correct mental model for what the code does, right? So that's that whole while loop versus for loop difference. If it's a good mental model, and clean code is a bit like wearing, maybe this is inappropriate, but clean code is a bit like wearing tight clothing, right? You can see what the code is doing, right? So if you're in a leotard, you can see what the body is, right? If I'm wearing, bike shorts, you can see what's there. Whereas if you're bringing a huge duffel jacket, coats, and many layers, that complexity means you don't know what is the underlying function, right? You don't know what's underneath those extra layers of clothing. So I think clean code allows you to see what the code is doing. Now that doesn't mean that it's necessarily good or bad. That just means it's uncluttered by other content. So if you were showing off your house, for example, you would declutter so people can see what is the house, rather than all your pictures and all your knickknacks and all your drawers and dressers and all the stuff in the way. So I know, and I think that's probably there's a part of people would see that clutter is covering something up. So you would put a whole bunch of things in the way of the holes in the wall. You put paintings over the stain on the wall, and you put you push the couch up against the nasty rip of the wallpaper, and you, like, if there's clutter, people might see it as hiding the bad things, and that's the only reason people put clutter in places, is to hide the bad things. And so there is a close association between like bad code and cluttered code. If we go up here and we have a look at this code, and I think C is going to have yes, it's dual typing, so as she can finish while I talk. Okay, that line of code I've got highlighted, Can someone comment on, like, what do you think about that piece of code? And the on grid, which is the code below it. And what do you think we should do about that code? Yes, Ferdinand, well done. The first thing I would suggest about this code is you make this a function. Now, what do we know about the naming conventions of functions? What do you think that function should be called? Because have you guys been told about naming conventions for functions? So if you had a function that's doing that kind of task, it could potentially be named something different. Um, yes, yes. So first, on edge, you might need to work out what they meant by on edge and what they mean by on grid. And I think on grid is particularly, I find this on grid equals, so there's a bit of a problem I have with this next line of code, just in terms of mentally processing, because my mind goes var on grid equals x mod 4. Okay, so on grid is x mod 4. That's okay, I understand that. Oh shit, now I have equals to, oh, oh no, okay, now this is, oh, that's not a function, that's not what gets returned. I get a comparator returned. Oh good, okay, it's a comparator. Oh no, and that, oh, that comparator. Oh, and why is there a random 6 here? What is a random 6 about? And why am I minus 6? I I can try and work it out why it's minus 6 and why its size is less than minus 6 and less than y minus 6, and something about modding by 4 being equivalent to the 2. So 0 and 1 aren't, 2 is, and 3 isn't. So that one is true. And why is it x the size minus 6? Well, that would imply the edge, which is a minus 2, coming off the sides. If I don't want to be on that one, I have to be 4 back from that one, which is minus 6, because this is minus 2 from up here, plus a cycle of 4 back. So that is minus 6, I think. Ah! Right? That that is not good code. Okay? Because there's a bunch of things in here. One is this minus 6 doesn't explain itself. It doesn't explain why it is a minus 6. Right? It would be far better if this was, size minus 2 and then in brackets minus 4, right? Or minus, like, if this was grid size, right? If 4 was grid size, right? You could go, okay, so this is minus 2 minus grid size times 1. Okay, so it's 1 grid step, right? So this could be grid step, actually. So if this was grid step, right? So 4 is now grid step. And this was grid position, So I could say grid step, grid position, grid step, grid position, um, or grid offset or something like that, because that would be if 0 was the first entry, then grid offset would be how many along the grid step it is. So that's the offset and the step. And then this would be size. I'm not sure. Like -1. Like if 0 is a boundary line, because that's what the -1 is, like less than or equal to negative, less than or equal to 1 is. So it on the edge is 1 and 1 off the top. So in fact, this is size -1 for being the step off the edge, because the edge is size -1 and the edge is 0. So 1 is still an edge, and size -1 is still an edge. So this is size -1, actual array length, right? So size -1. So size is not the max x, it's the max x plus 1, because it's, size rather than max x. So so size x -1 in brackets minus 1 for the edge minus grid step, right? So that -6 is actually being generated by a bunch of calculations, and by putting it in here and doing it in my head and going, aren't I clever, I've done what my math teacher told me to do, which was to skip over many steps to simplify my written equation. Your math teachers lied to you. They are assholes and you shouldn't believe them, right? Your high school math teachers were completely wrong about skipping steps. In code, do not skip steps. You write that shit down, because I want to have intermediate variables. I want to see what's going on, and I want the code to be able to understand it. Because the moment you start screwing around with skipping steps and doing that kind of thing together, you are destroying the functionality of other people understanding what's going on, right? So yeah, sorry, I get very passionate about that particular kind of thing in code, because it leads to errors. It leads to a whole bunch of problems. Okay, so is on edge. Yes, I think the function called is on edge would be an appropriate function. Now, if I saw an is on edge function in code, I might think the person was stressing about exams, because is on edge returns true does sound like a function you would write while you're studying. So too many numbers compared to variables. Yeah, no, it's the string of symbols where we've got an assignment, moderator, and then a comparator, all without brackets, all in a row, all where stopping at any point would give you valid responses, but each of them different and weird. So that would be a problem. Numbers should be abstracted. Functions names, I don't know. Good. Is piece on chessboard. You could do is on chessboard, or is on edge of board. Sorry, Sissy, I didn't mean to badmouth the math teacher in the room. Sorry, that was not my intent. But yeah, my experience is math teachers will often skip steps, because everyone knows why it's 6, and it's like, no, they don't. Okay, so yeah, so you're right. You turn it into a function, because yeah, the if this you can save the result of the function. Um, they're using a rand I %15. What's Now that's kind of one of you said there, which was numbers should be abstracted to named constant variables. This clearly should be a named constant variable, because there's no way you should have a mod 15 on a random variable buried deep inside your code, which is changing the frequency at which something occurs. Right? In Godot, that it should at least be a named variable at the top, which you then export, so you can put into the Godot interface, so you can edit that thing, right? So it should be a named export, right? And you may even decide to have a dictionary of those sorts of things, right? A dictionary of how, like a event dictionary, which talks about an event and how frequently it occurs. And then that is where you get this sort of, frequency of event. And I wouldn't bury it in a randi here. I'd do it in a function that would test that feature, because you might want to go and have a function, the function that does this random test. You could have in that function, you could have a check when it's called, chance of being a chance of generating prop. I think that's an edge prop. You might want to be able to not just say 115 and say what the chance is, because again, equaling 0 is just one way of calculating 1 in 15. There are many ways of calculating 1 in 15, and in fact, I would want to have almost, so remember we talked about when we talked about coding design patterns, we talked about a factory. There is actually a random number factory you can create that manages how your random numbers work, right? Because there are different ways of managing random. We talked about this when we talked about balance earlier in the course. If you change this to being a function that you can call, you can then change the distribution of your random allocation, not by changing a complex function here in this code, but over in the function that you call to generate that it does actually do the random decision on whether or not you should create a prop at that moment. Okay, so it's this idea of I move it away, I can then have more control of it. So for example, I think I used the example of Catan cards and versus the using Catan dice. Do you guys know the game Catan? So, and have you heard of Settlers of Catan? Yes, Settlers of Catan. Have you heard of Settlers of Catan, the Catan dice cards? So, I'll just have to find the right one, because there are Settlers of Catan cards, which are the Settlers of Catan game done as cards. But I'm just trying to find if I can find the official Settlers of Catan dice cards. I'll just see if it's that. So no, it's not that. So the idea of Settlers of Catan dice cards, I wonder if I can just find 36. 36 dice cards. So the idea is it's a pack of 36 cards that have the 36 2d6 rolls that you could get from rolling the dice in Settlers of Catan. So, but instead of rolling dice and coming from the global distribution, you come from a known deck of cards, and you're turning over the cards one at a time until you get to like the last 5 cards or 4 cards, and then you reshuffle. Right? So the idea is that within a single game of Catan, you probably only roll about 50 times. So you're only going to go once through and turn the pack, and then almost get through the second time. But that means every game you play has a almost uniform distribution of the random rolls, because they come up from, if I turn over the 2 card, I know for the next 35 cards, well, the next 30 cards, because I've got the 5 at the bottom, for the next 30 cards, I know I'm not going to have another 2. I can't, because I've used that up, right? So there is, you can do a bit of card counting, but the idea is that you don't use this. I'm just relying on system random to generate a random number. Right? So, and again, pulling it out of function, that would clean up that code. So yes, in fact, I asked Claude to clean it up for me, and did it did this at first. Should place edge prop, and then place edge prop, and do this. And I'm thinking, yeah, no, I mean that's moved the on edge into here. That's not that I it knew to make it knew to turn this stuff into functions, but it didn't pick the right functions, and it tried to preserve this horrific line. And so I did the whole, okay, you know, that's not going to be great. So can you clean up the code to be more readable? This is again a reasonable thing to ask it to. And then it does, haha, yes, make those constants. So yes, that is in a good way of initially cleaning it up. It then does the, okay, it should be if is edge tile. And then try and place decoration. It's still doing the can place middle decoration, but it's certainly the now is edge tile. I still don't like this particular way of doing things. I would rather have an if statement with multiple returns, but I can live with this more than I could live with it all being stretched along out the side and buried into that, right? And so trying those can place in middle uses an on grid, and here it does grid spacing and grid offset, right? So my sense of, you know, what I should have, I think I'd call it grid step rather than grid spacing, but grid spacing good, and an offset to see your thing. So again, minus minimum distance from edge. They didn't separate that out into edge minus grid space, right? So they could have done that. But yeah, so that was it improving the code, right? So and that is more readable. And in fact, if you want to make your code more readable, it is a perfectly reasonable use of ChatGPT and Claude to put your example code in and say, you know, can you make this code more readable? Because one of the things that ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini all do is that they are kind of averaged. They're uniforms. They are standards. Sometimes they're old standards because they've ingested a whole bunch of old code. So you'll notice that I actually explicitly said Godot 4.3, right? If you do not tell it Godot 4.3, it will think that all Godot is equally good, right? And it will give you outdated Godot because you haven't told it exactly which Godot you want, right? So tell it what you want. You say, take this code, make it more readable. And if you're doing this well, you would say, give me 3 more readable versions, right? Can you, I don't need to, give me 3 different versions that are all readable and maintained. Okay, so the idea of asking for multiple versions is that you are then telling it, you're asking it explicitly. Here are 3 different approaches to organizing each of these nodes for their own benefit. So event-driven approach. So it's going to try and do this with emitting events, and then someone else is going to receive that event, and it's using the internals. It's again still using the returns in that can place middle is thing. And then this is a data-driven approach, which is going to focus on, I'm just trying to look, pretty uniform, but it looks like it's pick random number. So it's still picking a random number. And then a third approach. Okay. Event-driven approach, yes. But page down. And that was data-driven approach. Here's the third one. Okay, sample usage. So, state machine approach, right? So and the reason to ask it for 3 different versions, and I must have missed the transition where it says this is now going to be a state class rules. Okay, so it's here. This is state machine approach, where it's written the placement as a decorating state with an init, a scanning, a placing, a middle placing, and a complete. And it sets it up as if this is a state machine, and it's going to go through and step through the different states one after the other. Now, that's not a particularly good approach, but if you look down here, it gives you why each of them is readable, and an example of how you might call each one of them, the event-driven, the data-driven thing. So event-driven, data-driven, you can operate separate logic. And you say that if you have a complex rules, you need to control the decoration process. So, you know, the advantage here is not that, you know, I've already got something that's working and I'm just trying to clean it up. It now gives me options to think about different ways I could approach code. And when I look at the code and go, oh, actually, that fits better with what I was thinking when I was designing this. So this is what I want people to be thinking when they read my code, right? And that's what I mean by alignment between your thinking and the model, right? Is that you could see each of these would work. It's just that they make your brain kind of like I thinking of the decorating the tiles using a finite state machine that would have initial things and then just step through each of the states one after the other. Like, no, that's overly complex, right? An event triggering thing where every time it found a thing, it would trigger the build something here and someone else would go and build it. It's kind of, I think I don't need to do that level of complexity, because I'm not really, unless I had a separate piece of code that was the factory making stuff, that's when I would do it that way, right? But so yeah, so what I'm saying here is that good code is readable by other people. It fits with the mental model of what you're trying to achieve. It doesn't bury computation. It doesn't bury calculations. When people ask you questions about it, well, ideally they shouldn't even have to ask you questions. But when people ask questions about it, you should be able to very clearly explain to them what's happening, right? So that they can very quickly maintain your code. Right? And this is part of the reason we want you to be working in groups, is that you then show your code to other group members and they comment on how easy it is to understand or not, right? Because people who have to use your code are the ones who can most accurately comment on the quality of your code. Now, something we're not doing this year, which I threatened to do in previous years, when I was doing a course about software engineering rather than about game development, was at this stage is we drop tools and you move over to finish developing an other group's game, and you take over all their code and all their documentation as it is now, and they get all your code and documentation as it is now, right? And everybody just shifts one project over, and now you have to suffer through reading other people's code and their documentation and what they were trying to achieve, and then they grade your ability to finish their game idea, right? Because, or in that case, their software tool. Because unfortunately, that is sometimes what happens in industry, is you are dumped into a project where that team has been taken off or somebody's left, or, you know, there's a project and you're thrown halfway in the middle of it, right? And to some extent, there's a level of trauma and pain caused by being dumped in a project that has terrible documentation and a stupidly short time frame, and that, you know, someone else is looking at your terrible code with an equally short deadline, and you hate the person who wrote this code, and you realize someone else is hating you right now because they're having to deal with your discarded code. And so there's a certain amount of, oh, this is so bad, I need to be better. So yeah, but I can't really inflict that sort of trauma on you in the middle of exams. And also, that's not, you haven't actually signed up to be traumatized by your lecturer. I know some of you will have been traumatized by your lecturers, and I apologize for them, but that shouldn't be the intent, right? When pain without focus is not useful learning. So, right. So yeah, so we've got Godot looks a bit Pytherian and a bit Rust-like or something. So actually, that's the other thing that it's quite good at doing is it's quite good at translating between programming languages, and that's something also if you're good you start doing. Most random chance in games have some bad luck protection, where for example a crit roll can be displayed to a player's 10%, but behind the scenes the crit rates constantly varies, where a missed critical will be more likely than a next attack is critical and vice versa. Yeah, so in fact explicitly in Civ, that's one of the balances they did explicitly in Civ was when you failed when you had an advantage and you failed to win the combat, in the next contest where you had advantage, you would be much, much, much more likely to win, because secretly behind the scenes, even though it was saying that you still had a 2-to-1 odds, you actually had like a 99-to-1 odds, because they didn't really want you to experience 2 losses in a row when you had advantage. So yeah, random is always predicted that way. Okay, so I've had you guys sitting for an hour, talking about some of that bad code and good code, some ways you might use AI to improve the readability of the code. Right, so what we'll do is we'll break and we'll come back, and I'll get you to break into your rooms, and I'll come and talk to you in each of your rooms, and you should continue development. Now, I was going to get Goonfly to do a presentation. Does anybody want to come back and present their game to the group this week? Otherwise, I would like to try and see all of the groups potentially presenting to all the groups their game next week, right? Because I know we're getting near the end, but I'd like to see at least that MVP of what you're doing so everyone else can see what everyone else is doing. Now, we can either do that live or you can record a video and send it to me, right? But I want you to decide whether you're going to do it live or record a video of your gameplay and present here, and then we can discuss. Now, I will need to be able to play your games, and even for people who haven't got very far, even if it's just a YouTube video showing off the best bits of your game or some characters in your game, I want everybody to kind of get a bit of a feeling where everyone is, because we're not judging each other at this stage. I'm not peer reviewing. You're not getting graded by other people. It's just so people can get a sense for what the other game development is like and maybe make some comment. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing for next week. So at the moment, I'll go and take a break. I'll get my daughter into bed because she's had her English exam today. So she's starting her year 11 exams. So she had her first one on Friday and she had her second one this morning. So I'll go and get her to bed and I'll come back in 10 minutes and you guys will break, go into your rooms, and I'll come back and start working through your rooms. Okay? Does that sound like a good idea? Cool. Okay, well, at least one person thinks it's a good idea. The rest of you can just bite me. Cool. Okay, I'll be back in 10. Bye, stream. That is... Oh, yeah, it's okay, Mark.